Do, 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 do. Salutations and blessings to all who are present and to those of you who are my gracious and merciful people. I hope all is well no matter when you listen to this. And you know what today is. Today is a special day because I know I have first time listeners and I have returning listeners, and that's what will always make it a special today. So my question is, who's in charge of your attitude? Yeah, that's how this episode starts. Because by now you should know that grief can have you ignoring how you act. Sometimes you ignore how you act because you're in a process called grief. If you've been listening, you know that I've been mentioning how certain stages can cause conspiracies, superstitions, and different games to where you feel like your mind is playing tricks on you. With that being said, let me get to the opening quote today. It doesn't come from me, but it comes from a particular person named Seneca. And the quote is, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." That's an amazing quote for what we're about to talk about today. Because today we're talking about the final 3 stages in the 7 stages of grief. And like I said, if you've been paying attention, that's what I've been covering. And as I've done some research on grief, I originally only thought it was 5, as I said in the first episode. But the research allowed me to have these immaculate shows that I've been having, starting with the first one of this season, starting with a episode 36, simply titled Grief, which had Miss Christina Jones, who is an amazing person in her own right. And she is the host of a delightful podcast called Unlearning Podcast. So if you get an opportunity, make sure you go and stop by her podcast, follow her pages, get that motivational aspect in those conversations that she be delivering. But in that show, we covered 1 and 2, stages 1 and 2. We talked about shock and denial, which is just the first stage. And we talked about how shock can last for weeks. And we also talked about how we was going through some things at that point in our lives. Not we as in me and her, but we as in me and as in her and I. She was going through some things in her life, and I was going through some things in my life. And then phase 2, pain and guilt. Life feels chaotic and scary during this phase. And, it was make sure you check into those shows to see exactly what we all covered in that. But we touched on a lot of things to make sure those who listen was able to understand what those first 2 stages are. Then as I progressed, I went ahead and went to episode 78. And I talked about stage 3 and 4, which is when we get into anger and bargaining. And a little bit more about anger and bargaining. It's depending on if you're ready for grief counseling. This is a step that it might be a good place or a good choice for you to look into. So you're starting to deal with some anger issues and bargaining. Try counseling. And then 4, depression, reflection, loneliness. You may sense feelings of emptiness or despair. Doing steps 3 and 4, I had amazing guests from Lighthouse Counseling on with me, and the counselor herself who deals in grief. And it was a very amazing episode because Miss Lucy Edens was able to talk about what it's like to be on the counseling side of those two steps. And that brings me to today, because what does grief feel like? And grief actually is different from each, is different for each and every person. And so as we all do deal with it in different ways, it's different for each and every person. The steps identify what each and every person goes through, but it doesn't tell how each and every person deals with it. As I've stated, I've already covered 4 of the 7 stages of grief. And once again, make sure you go check out episode 56 and 78. I believe that's what it is, 56 and 78. And leave a comment, like, share with someone you know who may be going through those stages of grief. We all deal with it in different ways. But somewhere in between the stages, you start to figure things out. Like a big one is you start to understand your story, the details of what you tell others, and how much you're going to tell others, when you're going to tell others. Sometimes it's not your story to tell, it's your story to continue. It's not your story because you were never told why it happens. You just got older and continued the next chalets and never answered. But you either never asked, found out, or got an answer. So that brings me to the final 3 stages, 5 through 7. But even though you've never found out those things, this is when life begins to life. And that's where I call this final 3 stages of grief, when life be life. Because that's exactly what life does. Life continues on like nothing's happening to you, but life can't stop because something's happening to you. Which brings me to step 5, phase 5. Phase 5 is called the upward turn. And it's in this phase that you start to adjust to life. Without your dear one, your life becomes a little calmer or more organized. Your physical symptoms lessen and your depression begins to lift slightly. So this is also when life be lifing, because you can be suffering from a loss, it be a job, a pet, a loved one, any of that. Anything that you lose can send you in a state of depression. But as you heard me say in step 5, the upward turn is sometimes around the corner, but it's sometimes making those steps to get to the corner that's the toughest. But it's also part of the grieving process that you'll start to see the light a bit at the end of the tunnel. The light never goes out as much as the dark starts to encompass the little bit of the light that you see. Ooh, I like that. The light never goes out as much as the darkness starts to encompass the much of the little bit of the light that you see. Yeah, remember, y'all heard that here first. It's a middle ground on all grief symptoms that you'll go through, but it's one that you can build up on. So some examples of emotions during this stage of grief, during upward turn. You start to be motivated. It feels like you awakened, and it also feels like you're regaining some strength. So the upward turn, and speaking of motivated, that can come simply from someone, you actually hearing someone start to say, "Hey, how are you doing today? Good morning." And they can be saying it to you the entire time you was going through your grief, but you didn't hear it until now. And then all of a sudden you're like, "Hey, I'm doing pretty good. Thank you." And how about repeating it back to them? And that brings me to step 6, reconstruction and working through it. Sometimes we do need to rebuild. There's an old saying, like, you don't want to burn your bridges. That's true. But what about the reconstruction of that bridge and working through what was burned? Because as you become more functional, your mind starts working again. And you will find yourself seeking realistic solutions to problems posed by life without that which you have lost. You will also start to work on practical and financial problems. A lot of times you're going through grief, bills get behind, your bank get withdrawn. So a lot of things, once you get on the other side, remember you've already hit the upward turn. Now you see how to reconstruct and work through. So you have to rebuild that credit. You have to rebuild that trust, not just trust with everyone else, but the trust with you. And reconstructing yourself and your life without whatever that was lost is no longer there. So you have to rebuild the construction your life and work through it without them. Some examples of some emotions during this stage of grief is you're more inspired to rebuild it. You're more inspired to reconstruct it. You're more inspired to work through it. And that inspiration turns to determination because you know what it's like to be on the other side now. And you see what you came from. Now you see where you can go to. You also feel refreshed. And there's nothing like taking that deep breath and it feel like it's the first deep breath you've ever taken. But sometimes when life be lifing, you just got to stop and take a few breaths. As a matter of fact, why don't we take a few breaths right now? Everybody breathe in, slow pace. Hold it for a second. Clear your mind. And as you clear your mind, let it out. Breathe in again. As you breathe in again, hold it. Once you feel yourself getting to that relaxed point, let it out. And don't be holding your breath because you don't feel like you relax. You go ahead and let that breath out. I don't want you to be like, well, I was on this podcast and he told me hold his breath and I ain't let it out because he said till I get relaxed. Yeah, y'all go ahead and let your breath out. Because that takes us to the next step, the last phase, which is acceptance and hope. The breathing technique is effective because once you breathe in, you know when you need to breathe again. So you have to accept the fact that you can't hold your breath for as long as you can hold your breath. But there's hope that you may be able to get another second, but you know you continue to do it. It only gets better. So by now, you've worked through all of the phases. And at this point, you know that you've put in the work, the upward turn has happened, you're motivated, you're determined, and you've learned to accept and deal with the reality of your situation, whatever that may be. I just want to say that it's not a competition when you're going through grief. You shouldn't look at it as my situation is worse than them. Their situation is better than mine. Grief is its own situation, and it is what it is. And some people figure it out, some people don't. But if you're working through the stages isn't a 7-week program. It can happen as long as it takes for you to recover. Which means that acceptance does not necessarily mean instant happiness. Because given the pain and the turmoil you have experienced, you can never return to the carefree, untroubled you that existed before the tragedy. But you will find a way forward. You can never really return to you anyway, but you can always become a better version of you. You should always strive to be a better version of you. and you will start to look forward and actually plan things for the future. And sometimes your future is right now. Eventually, you will be able to think about whatever you have lost. So I know for a lot of people, it's pets, and pets can also be perceived as loved ones. I'm just going to say it. Death happens. Death happens. Sometimes this happens when it's expected, and then it's the unexpected ones that put us in a bind, that put us through these 7 steps. And it's sadness. Yes, it's sadness. And we all go through it. We all go through it. But we all go through it in our own stages, in our own way, in our own time span. So if you've been listening to all of these steps, I urge you not to rush the grieving process, but take your time and go through it. Don't push it off, because if you push it off, it's going to make it worse, because that day that you do go through it is going to be a wave of emotions that hit you all at one time. If you need to cry, cry. That's not a man thing. It's not a woman thing. It's not a whatever your pronouns thing is. Animals cry. Everything on this world cries. I'm a religious person. Jesus wept. There's a lot of spiritual people that has wept. I cry. And you can always think about the good times that you've had, but how about anticipating the good times that you're going to have? How about anticipating the good times that you foresee yourself having in the future? How about speaking that into fruition? Because your verbiage matters too. Even finding joy again in the experience of living. Just because life is lifing, that doesn't mean you have to stop and watch it. But sometimes you need to stop and be part of it. You have made it through the 7 stages of grief with me, and I appreciate you all listening to what I've had to bring, to the multiple guests that I've had on. With the 7 stages of grief is something that I really wanted to talk about, because of I understand how the world works. I understand how life works, because I'm still in it. That's why it's titled "When Life Be Lifing." Some examples of the 7th stage. In this stage, you have more hope, you're more confident, you're more relaxed, you're more secure. So, you have a better stage of things you have built your life around this time than it is from the first stage. I appreciate everyone listening. The final quote for this, to close out this grief session, is: grief is in 2 parts. The first is loss. The second is the remaking of life. And that is a quote from Annie Roify. She's a writer. No matter what life has in store for you, or how much that life gets to lifing, and it seems like you're just standing still while life is lifing, there's a few things you can do while life is lifing. You can observe how beautiful it is. You can remember all those memories from your lost and loved ones. You can focus on what it would be like to see them again one day. You can always go back and listen to these episodes from this podcast, from the one episode 56, 78, and this episode 91, to help you through those stages. If you just need to talk to somebody, you can send me an email. I have friends that I can also forward those emails to, if you would like. If you don't, I can give you advice from my standpoint. You can send those emails to tedyism@gmail.com. I'll read them, give you my best advice, my honest advice. I am in no way a counselor. I am in no way a doctor, but I can listen. I can give you my advice. And from my Tedyism, my wisdom, I want you to know that when you sit down and you take your time and think about it, When you continue to move swiftly and move slowly, but move one step at a time, you're doing it at your own pace. I'll bless you next time.